This is the newest episode of JAGcast. We're back. It is the spring semester 2016. I am the editor-in-chief of the Mesquite-News.com at A&M San Antonio. And with me is the assistant editor, Ingrid Wilgen.
Hello, everybody.
And Jerry Quijano.
Is behind the camera now this semester. Yeah,
yes.
Got something different going on this semester.
He's got something
awesome.
to do.
Yeah,
something to do instead of just sit there. So now I'm Oscar Gonzalez, and so with JAGcast, it's for the Mesquite, the student news outlet, and we talk about what's going on campus. We talk about what's happening with the professors and students. And then there's sometimes where we talk amongst our reporters and just, talk about journalism. And today's going to be kind of one of those days. We don't have a guest on per se, but we do have some guest audio. So we spoke with Viana Davila. She's a reporter for the Express News, and she was part of the team that broke the news that Supreme Justice Justice Antonin Scalia passed away this past weekend. So she was part of that team that uncovered that. And we have Ingrid here because she, on the weekends, is at the Express News. Yes. And sure enough, it just happened to be one of the most exciting weekends ever.
The most exciting day I've ever had in the newsroom. It was amazing.
So we're going to have Viana. She's going to break it down to where, from the reporter side, she's going to talk about her sources and how she had to run around and talk to a bunch of people and try to, verify that it actually happened. But Ingrid here. So Ingrid, what happened? How did the news come about that all of a sudden someone called an editor at the Express News and said, Antonin Scalia is dead? And everybody had to verify it. So
It was crazy. I'm sitting at the phones because I'm the editorial assistant. So I'm sitting at the phones, manning the phones, and trying to crank out my obituary for the day.
Okay.
And all of a sudden, Gary says from the back, because he sits way in the back of the newsroom, he says very loudly, Anthony Scalia is dead. Everything stopped. People said, what?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, then it was such a sense of urgency behind him with those words.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone stopped, they thought about it, and then they all got to work. I've never seen such teamwork in my life. I mean, it was amazing. People were calling their sources left and right. People were being called in. I was asked to call in a photographer. I mean, it was pandemonium. It was crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Viana explains about that pandemonium and how she handled it and how the team handled it. When we all listened to her a bit ago. So, I mean, Jerry, what did you think when you heard about her whole process of how she had to call, literally called her boyfriend to say, like, do you know anybody?
Yeah.
that we could contact and verify this?
Yeah, one of the things that I found very interesting was I think it's really awesome that you were there. I think we live in such an age where you get your news right away to your phone. Mm-hmm. And, you hear, we hear our professors say, I was in the newsroom when this happened, or I was at the studio when this happened. So for you to actually be there in this day, this information age, I think it's just so cool. Like, what are the chances of you, interning and then you're there on that day?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, oh my goodness.
Well, it showed me the importance of being in this field for a while. Because I'm new to this field. Mm-hmm. And I was like, if it had been me, I wouldn't have had anyone to really call. Mm-hmm. These people have been in this field for a long time, have a lot of friends, have a lot of sources. And it was amazing how people from years ago came up to the plate and wanted to talk about what was going on. So that was really fun.
Yeah, I could tell when we were talking with Viana. Since I've had my own website, there are like instances where I had to break news, and it's exciting. Because you're just oh my god, you're like that, just wanting to say it. So, question to you though is that, did you Did you think about telling anyone else? Like, did you think about like texting someone? Oh my God, we got a big story.
You know what? After they confirmed it, guess who I text first?
Who?
The
Professor
Mesquite.
Moore.
No, I put it, the Mesquite News Group. I put it on
Oh,
the
yeah.
Mesquite News Group. It was like, and then I put it out on my Facebook. People wanted to know if it was true. Where did I get this information from?
Oh wow.
Yeah, I mean, it was
That's
like,
crazy.
no, we scooped it. We scooped it. No one had really heard of the Express News or the San Antonio Express News. It kind of woke people up to their existence.
Well, it was funny with me because I was at my computer and I was working on stuff, and then one of the reporters, Rene Guzman, who I follow on Twitter, his was the first one that came up for me, and because he got it up quick. I don't know if he was there that day and helped, or well, he obviously didn't help. He was there, but I mean, I don't know what it was, but it literally the second it was up, he tweeted it.
Oh yeah.
And I retweeted it because there was some stupid stuff going on, and I'm like, here's some real news. And then it just went from there. And I go on Reddit a lot, and I posted on Reddit, and immediately all the comments were like, oh my God, this is huge if this is true. Who's this Express
Yes,
News?
Yeah.
yes. By the end of the day, we had 4 million hits. The Express News had 4 million hits. By the next day, it was over 5 million.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can tell you, it was like, yeah, that was, and you're going to hear with Viana talking about it, how important it was to verify this, because this was everything.
Well, yes, and I remember Gary saying, hey, we've got to verify this. We've got to verify it. Everyone was trying to verify it, but no one would go on the record for like 30 minutes. No one would go on the record to this man's death. And then the circumstances behind his death. Where was he found? That story was changing all the time. For 30 minutes, people were saying, oh, he was found outside. And someone said, oh, no, he was found in his room. So even that was changing. And they were trying to get confirmation for all of it.
Yeah, it was nuts.
It was crazy.
Yeah. So we're going to have that audio coming up. The audio was a little, not the best. We tried to do it via Skype. Skype wasn't responding as we should. So it was done via just recording a call with us in the newsroom, Professor Moore and Professor Townsend. So you hear us in the background, and I'm the one asking Viana the questions. But I think it's very interesting because right after that article went up, a few hours after the article went up, there was a lot of additional articles of like how this, big news came from a smaller news outlet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the Pointer posted something, Slate posted something where it's just like, look at how these reporters confirmed one of the biggest news stories of the year.
And they called pretty quickly because I was on the phones. So Time called, Pointer called, Slate called. Who else? New York Times called for an interview with Gary. All throughout the day, these big media outlets were calling. And Gary's on a deadline. He's trying to crank the story out. At the same time, they're wanting to interview him. It was amazing.
What'd you have to tell them?
Well, towards the end, I had to take messages because
Yeah.
he didn't even want the calls coming back to his phone because it was too thick. He was like, get a message, write it down, and I'll call him back.
Okay.
It got to that point. Yeah.
What other calls were you getting?
The first one was from the New York Times.
Right.
Yeah. And then after that.
How long, what kind of time frame was it after the story was published? Like, how long do you think it was that they
I think
called?
about maybe 45 minutes. And that call was, is it true?
Right.
Yeah. Who's your source? Let me talk to your editor. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, relax, buddy, relax.
Yeah. People were going crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then towards the end of the day, the phone calls were, how did you get the story? And can we talk to someone? They didn't, and Gary by that time was like, trying to, get everything honed in and together. He was really busy, so he really couldn't talk. And they wanted to know how such a small paper, they call it small, was able to get the information so fast. And so that was part of that. And then Gary's sources, they wanted to know who his sources were, So that was kind of interesting. But Gary's been in the field for over 30 years.
Yeah.
So, he's packed with sources.
That's where it goes.
Yeah.
All right, so up next is the audio. Make sure to visit mesquite-news.com. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at The Mesquite. You can follow Ingrid on Twitter.
On Twitter, I Wilkin.
I_Wilkin.
That's right.
Okay. Jerry.
Jerry Quijano.
And me at Original Gamer 1 on Twitter. So up next, Viana Davila Audio. And then in the coming weeks, we'll have more people from the university. And we'll be talking about more campus stories. Okay, see you.
So we'll go back to the first question now regarding the big story with Anthony Scalia dying over the weekend. Basically it was a matter of that a call came in saying, hey, this is happening, from a source that didn't want to be named.
Right. So Bruce Davidson, who is the head of our editorial board at the Express News, he got the tip from a federal source. So Bruce then called Gary Martin, who was the actual editor on Saturday, and passed along this tip that Scalia had died out in West Texas. And from what I understand, the source, whoever it was who called Bruce, also knows Gary. And that's important because Gary was able to call this guy directly, or actually it could be a woman, I don't know who it is, call that person directly and communicate. Because the thing about sources, if they don't know you very well, they're not likely to give you a lot of information. That's not always true, but it really helps if you have a good relationship. Excuse me. So Gary, called this source who had originally tipped off Bruce and said, hey, is this true? And the source said yes. And so Gary then asked me and Tyler White, who was at MyFA reporter, he does the police checks on Saturday mornings.
Uh-huh.
And I was there. We have a weekend rotation where all the reporters have to work at least one weekend every couple months. And so it was my rotation. Although, remind me to get back to that later.
Okay.
So Tyler was there, and he's normally there. I was there, and it was just my rotation. And another reporter named Rich Marini was there, and Rich also was on his weekend rotation. So Gary comes over to Tyler and I, because Rich sits on the other half of the newsroom, and basically said, this is what happened. You guys need to prove this, because the source wouldn't go on the record. And so the first thing that ran through my mind is, I really hope he's not dead, because how are we going to prove this?
All right.
So we just sort of started, I said, okay, Tyler, who are you going to call? And I'll call these other people. That's really important, another thing, to sort of designate who's calling who, because if you start getting repetitive in like a really intense situation like that, you could start annoying people or pissing them off.
Mm-hmm.
So he was, we heard that this had happened in Presidio County, which is way in West Texas. So he started calling a lot of Presidio County officials. And I started calling law enforcement sources that I knew of. Gary had a couple of names of people that he thought I should try, so I was trying to find them, running down different traps. Whom I know. I started calling medical examiners' offices because I thought, maybe they'll send a medical examiner out there, and maybe they would know. And so it's just a matter of trying to find someone who could corroborate the details that Gary had gotten from his source.
So one thing I was wondering over the weekend is that why the Express News? I mean, was it specific because of that relationship, and that was the only person the source called? Or, I mean, were there do you think there was other newspapers trying to get on this and that they were called as well?
I'm going to assume there were other newspapers trying to get on this. I know that the Texas Tribune had a story maybe half an hour or an hour after we did, and they weren't quoting they had a source. I can't tell you that, I think it's a mix of, having good sources and chance, maybe, Gary has been in the business for 30 years, something like that. Mm-hmm. And not only that, he's worked for the Express News 30 years. And same with Bruce. Bruce has been in the business for, decades and worked for us for decades. So when you worked in the business that long, the relationships you have are so important. So I don't know how long the source of theirs had known Gary and Bruce, but this person knew them enough to trust them. And that comes from years of work and having good source relationships. So, was it that no one else there had a good relationship with a reporter in Texas? Maybe. I'm not sure why, but the fact that Gary had such a sense of urgency was incredibly helpful because he knew immediately the impact. I think what was also important is that rather than assuming, we're the Express News, we can't get this, it's going to be the New York Times, Gary was thinking, why couldn't we get this? Why shouldn't we be able to get it? And another side 20 years, but he's been in the business even longer. And he covers West Texas all the time. And sometimes one of my editors was saying that people give us a hard time because we cover West Texas so much, because it's so far away.
Right.
Well, by chance, John was out there, covering this event in Valentine, Texas, which isn't too far from where Justice Scalia passed away. That was actually a little bit of chance because John was actually supposed to work in the office this past Saturday, and I was supposed to work the previous Saturday.
Okay.
But John had asked to switch with me specifically so he could go out to West Texas to Valentine. So if he hadn't switched, he wouldn't have been there. We wouldn't have had a photographer there. I mean, that's where it's like chance, Like, we couldn't have known that by switching, I'd be in the office and he'd be out there. But the fact that he was out there, that he had a relationship, that he knew where to go, it was perfect timing, and again, having those good relationships.
So on your end, when you were calling around, I mean, how many calls were you doing, and what kind of responses were you getting? Were people just like, whatever, crazy, or were they? I mean, did you get responses right away saying, I think we've heard that? I mean, how was that calling around and running the traps?
I feel like I must have called 20 to 30 people.
Right.
Or less. And a lot of them, no one answered. You just leave a message. And you don't necessarily say, depending on who it is, you might just say, please call me back. I'm calling about breaking news, Presidio County or something like that. Mm-hmm. At one point, Gary got the name of another official who was out there. And I called that person and actually got a hold of him. And, what this person said was like, I'm sorry, I can't tell you anything. I think this person said, like, I'm headed that way, but I can't say anything. And the fact that this person was, like, so, like, it made me feel more confident that I wasn't crazy, that this wasn't crazy. Because if I had been like, hey, Edwin Scalia died, have you heard that? And they were like, you're crazy. It was like, no. Maybe I would have been like, I don't know. But the fact that he was so tight-lipped kind of made me feel like, okay, we can't use that because this person's literally not saying anything. But it made you feel more confident that this was real. But other people, I was trying to reach, I had covered wildfires in Fort Davis, which is also out there, about 5 years ago. And I went through those stories, and every person that I quoted, I looked up their numbers in a search engine and was leaving messages. I mean, Fort Davis, if you know anything about West Texas, nothing's close together.
Right.
So Fort Davis is not like it's next door to where this guy died. It's probably a good 40-minute drive, maybe more. But I was like, maybe there's a connection, because some of these were fire officials, so I was like, maybe they know something. So I just went message after message. I called EMS, I called all these things, hoping. I called at one point a church in Marfa, because Marfa's pretty close, because I thought Edwin Scalia is Catholic. Maybe they sent a priest to give him his last rites. And in the end, that was true. They actually sent a priest from another town to say, I was on the right track. I just didn't get the right church. But, so things like that, they're just thinking, maybe someone knows something. Maybe someone knows something. And Tyler was calling officials in Midland. He used to work in Midland. Because Midland, it's not physically close, but it's the closest kind of large city.
Right.
And they were being very tight-lipped as well. But they were the same way that when I called that official, and the official was like, I'm headed that way, but I can't tell you anything, Tyler was getting the same sort of type of response. And some of the people he was talking to, can't really say anything on that kind of thing. So again, those are like little tidbits that like, no, you're on the right path. And the other thing I did, and this is really good advice for all of you, is call like all your resources. So I texted my boyfriend, who's a reporter at the paper. He covers a lot of border stuff. And I said, do you know anyone out there in Presidio County? And he said no, but he said call Guillermo Contreras, who is one of our federal reporters, which, in the heat of the moment, I didn't even think about, but that was exactly the right thing to do. Because Guillermo has so many federal sources. He's the same thing with getting people off the record to indicate that this had happened. Mm-hmm. So it's all evidence that sort of boosts your confidence into what you need. And then there was someone that I thought we should call. I didn't have this person's number, but Gary, the editor who got the original tip, he had it. And he said, give me that person's number. I'm going to call that person because I think they'll know. And I did. And this person didn't know, but this person said, I can call someone who will.
Okay.
And I'll call you back. And I was like, there's no way this person's going to call me back. This person's going to call the New York Times. Oh, because this person didn't know me. We had zero relationship. But this person called me back, and the first word this person said was, it's true.
And that ended up being one of the sources? One of the confirmation?
One of the sources. And really, Guillermo, this is another lesson to everybody, is have one central source of communication. Because really everything should have been going through Gary, right? So not only was he kind of the main reporter now, he was the editor. Guillermo was communicating with me. And it was getting very confusing because, he can't reveal who his sources are, right? Gary can't reveal who his sources are because we have to protect them. And so it's like, well, is Guillermo's source Gary's source, are they just because the details were very similar? Well, is that because the details are correct, or is that because they have the same, where is this information coming from? And really, we might have, I wonder if we could have confirmed this even faster if Guillermo could communicated directly with Gary. But, that didn't happen. And so then I got the person I called to say it's true, and then I grilled that person. How do you, this, and kind of going through all these points. Who told you? How is that person in a position to know, can you corroborate these other details that Gary's source had said? And this person could. And mind you, this person also was like, don't throw me under the bus. Because, so we had to be very careful about protecting our sources in this case. And so I went to Gary, and Gary was just so confident by this point that it was real. He called our main editor, Mike Leary, who he'd been communicating with the whole time. That's very important, too. And he told Mike, here's what we have, here's what we know. And Mike said, okay, go with it. And then Gary wrote a very short story, 5 graphs. And then I asked Gary, let's go graph by graph, paragraph by paragraph, and say, make sure, because I think what it was, the original story, the first paragraph says official said. It's plural.
Right.
And I said, I want to make sure that every detail in that first paragraph, we can confirm that your source and the person I just called, they gave us every detail in that graph, so that we can say with confidence, officials plural. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so actually I called back the person I called 3 times, I think, and be like, double check and double check and double check. So this is right. Okay, this is right. This is right. And then we sent it online, and I've never been more scared in my entire life for reporting life. But then about 10 minutes after that, Guillermo got a federal judge to go on the record about it. And that's when we're like, okay, we're golden.
So from the initial call to the actual publication of the first, the first story with the 5 graphs, how much time was that?
I think it was about an hour and a half. Sorry, I got a text message. I think about an hour and a half to 2 hours.
Wow. Something
in that window. So I kept refreshing the New York Times website because like they're going to break this news, And I Googled instantly his name, just to be like, is anyone reporting that he's dead? Because it just, it just seemed to me impossible that someone else, basically what he said, that a federal source wouldn't have called some bigwig. But we were very conscious of not calling anything related to media. They have a public radio station out there in West Texas called Marfa Public Radio. Right. And at one point it was suggested, maybe they know. And I was like, do not call them. Because, don't call the Midland paper. Don't call the, someone even suggested, they have a little paper out there called, I think it's called Big Ben Now. And they're not their website isn't a breaking news website at all. We'll call them. And I was like, no, we're not calling. Because, they're going to call NPR. Who knows? So that was sort of the biggest concern. Because the more time that passed, the more likely it was that someone else would get it.
Yeah, I remember when that story came up, and I saw it in a few places. Immediately, everybody, all the comments were just, this is a small paper. This can't be right.
I know. I think someone even said, is the Express News a real paper?
Exactly. Yeah. So after it was published, what started happening? It comes up and it starts spreading. What started happening in the newsroom? Did you start getting more calls about this? Were all the bigger papers calling to verify with you? What happened?
A few things happened. So when Gary first told us about this, the people in the newsroom were Gary, me, Tyler, and Rich Mooney, the other GA. Tyler was the crime reporter. Early on, before we had confirmed, Michelle Fortier, who's our one of our photo editors, he came in for his shift. And so he immediately, when we told him what was going on, started communicating with Edwin Ellis, a photographer who was out in West Texas with John McCormick, the reporter. So he sent them there. So that's all happening at the same time. They're racing to the ranch. That's how Ed got those phenomenal photos of a hearse going into the property.
Right.
And that's important because we were the only people that had those photos. So, and also in the meantime, one of our online editors, Rachel Gleason, she came in early because she heard this was happening, and so she used to work in Midland as well. So she had all these, so she was, giving me ideas of call this person. She was calling people, and by chance, her sister, I believe, currently goes to St. Mary's Law School, and her sister told her, Scalia has this relationship with maybe Rachel or I actually don't know that, but her sister was telling her, he has this relationship with St. Mary's Law School, and here's all these professors who he's worked with. Oh. So Rachel, comes in, she tells me this list, and so once it was online, a few things started happening. The numbers on the page views start going crazy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other person that was in there, I apologize, was Chris Quinn, who was the My Essay editor that day. So he's like yelling. He was there the whole time. He's like yelling out these numbers, like we've hit 25,000. We've hit, it's just surging. So that's one thing. Is I think we all were like watching like social media. Suddenly this thing is going everywhere within minutes. So that's one thing that starts happening. For Rachel and I, we ended up doing is dividing up the names of the law professors at New Scalia, and then I used again LexisNexis, which is a database that we have to look up their numbers because that time I have a former coworker who works at St. Mary's Law School, but I had her phone number incorrect. So when I called her to be like, "Can you help me with this?" I was calling the wrong person.
Okay.
So since I didn't hear from her, I didn't bother. I was just like, "All right, I gotta go." So we looked up all of these lawyers' phone numbers in Nexus, and then Rachel said, "Let's create a Google Doc," which is very smart, so we could both be in it. And we listed as I found these people's numbers, I would add them in to this Google Doc for these law professors. And we just started saying, "I'll take this one, you take this one," and calling. And like one of the numbers, Nexus calls like a lot of numbers, people associated with you. So the first number I called, it was for the brother of this one law professor. He was out of state. They said, "I'm trying to find blah, blah, blah." They said, "Oh, it's my brother." I said, "Do you have a cell phone?" He said, "Sure." And so he gave it to me. I mean, you never know.
Right.
And so then I called that guy, and then that guy said, "You should talk to this other professor. Here's his number." And so I called that guy, and Rachel called, another guy too, and got a really good interview there. So that's kind of what we were doing. In the newsroom, Ed's pictures went online fairly quickly. So that's what started happening. They started getting phone calls from all these news outlets. Ingrid was there, of course, and Ingrid is taking all these phone calls, and being incredibly professional. Like, I heard her, I'm trying to think, it was like ABC's calling, CNN's calling, ESPN's calling, because they wanted the photos. And so then she would forward this call to Michelle, the photo editor, and he was basically like, "We're liking them through this website." In other words, you have to pay for them. So, and then meanwhile, Gary and Rich, was trying to get more information to flesh out the story. And once it's out there that he's dead, and it's true that he's dead, people are much more willing to talk. You know what I mean? Because then it's not this big secret. And I also called Charlie Gonzalez, who's a former congressman. And I know Charlie from when he used to work at VIA, Metropolitan Transit, and I used to cover VIA. So I called him, wondering maybe he has some connection. And he didn't have a connection to Scalia. He'd only met him once. He had kind of a funny anecdote about that. But he also had really good insight into, like, congressionally what this would mean for the president and things like that. So we were able to use that. So all these things are coming together. And then John McCormick, the one who was out in West Texas, he needed someone to take dictation. And dictation is where you literally are like, read off your notes when someone types it out because he couldn't get any Wi-Fi.
Okay.
So he called me, or they transferred him to me, and I typed out his description of the scene, this ranch.
Right.
And then meanwhile, once it was confirmed, like Tyler and Rachel also started putting together all this online stuff, interactive packages, calling, Tyler was really smart and started calling a bunch on Twitter, like what were people saying about Scalia's death, and putting together like a little package there. So it was a true team effort.
One thing I forgot I didn't ask that I think we actually is, what do you ask someone when you're making these calls? What's your question to them without giving, like you said, giving it away? I mean, what did you say when you actually talked to someone? What was your specific saying? I need to find out about this. How did you phrase the question without giving it all away?
It depends on like for instance, one of the law enforcement sources that Gary had, he said call him. He said he'd retired, but maybe he knows someone, because we knew that the U.S. Marshal Service was headed out there. And he said, call this retired U.S. Marshal, maybe he knows someone. And so in that case, I just said, are you still in contact with some marshals, in particular any marshals that might head to West Texas? And this guy was like, I have absolutely no contact with anybody else. In the Marshal Service, I couldn't help you. Right, so in that case, I didn't even bother to tell him why I was calling. I was like, okay, you have no contact, so forget that one. I think when I called, like, the Presidio County EMS dispatch, I was just like, hey, have you been dispatched to this ranch? Or, that kind of thing. And they were just like, I don't think so. I can't remember what they said. And I was like, okay. And I was like, so I think I had some stuff like, have you had any crazy calls? Like, calls about a death? And they're like, no. You're just sort of testing the water sometimes. But sometimes you have to be really blunt. So when I called the person that ultimately was like, told me that yes, it was true, right, I just flat out said it. I mean, I was like, this is what I've heard. Because there would have been no point with that person to be around, because it was like, do you know or do you not? Yeah. And that person later told me that they thought it was going to be a bad rumor.
Right.
That they that they were like, whatever, and were shocked that it was true. I mean, so, it just depends on the situation. Now, when I did leave voicemails with people, I did not tell them why. Sometimes it's good to tell people why you're calling in a voicemail so that they're very clear, but other times I don't think you need to. And this was one of those cases where I was just like, I have a breaking news question. Please call me.
Gotcha.
Because I felt that would be a little too risky to leave it on a voicemail, but that's just me.
Now, have you guys in the newsroom done sort of a debriefing? I mean, where you just sort of looked at how everything was handled and just talked about it yet?
We haven't, and that would be a really excellent idea.
Okay.
But we haven't.
No. How long? So.
Well, I should caveat that I don't know if the editors have, but I haven't been part of one.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
And was there, since it started off with 5 graphs, I mean, was there any thought of like making? Was it always planned that you were just going to keep adding to the story? Because the story by the end of the day was like a couple thousand words practically.
Right. I think they knew earlier on that they wanted to add to that story, but then they also at one point called in Bill Lambrecht, who's our Washington, D.C. reporter, and they knew they wanted a second story because Bill has the resources and the knowledge to sort of build that D.C., what does this mean, here's, story.
Right.
So I think they definitely made the decision pretty quickly that we would have a longer story, that we would just keep fleshing out the breaking news. I'm not sure at what point they decided, to pull our DC reporter in.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, some places if the breaking news, they leave it pretty short, and then they do 4 or 5 stories right after. But your story kept on getting bigger and bigger.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Well,
can I make one quick little point about that?
Sure.
Or one thing. So we put up the breaking news story, and within 10 to 15 minutes, Guillermo called me and said, "I have someone on the record." Guillermo got someone on the record, and so we added that pretty quickly, right?
Right.
But the first story, the one that had officials said, that version is the one that went everywhere. Because it was the first story. Eventually it was updated. That's just, something to keep in mind, the first thing you put out is the one that's going to haunt you. So to keep that in mind. Because if we had been wrong, or even gotten, a major detail wrong, it would have been you can't put that genie back in the bottle.
Yeah.
So
how long was that day that you weren't supposed to be there?
Well, I would because we switched. So technically, it wasn't off. I mean, the funny part was that I had this other daily that I was mostly done with. So I was like, I was supposed to call back this one person, and I totally let that person hanging because I was working on this. But it probably was it was a long day. I think it was a 10-hour day.
Yeah.
But it could have been. I mean, that's not that bad. It could have been an 18-hour day. I think for Gary it was something like an 18-hour day. Okay. And then he had to come back in the next day on his day off, so we worked very hard.
So any other questions from anybody here? Press some more? No?
It's a great summary, really interesting, Deanna.
Thank you guys for showing an interest.
I wanted to let you know